The night was too quiet, too perfectly staged, like a set before a grand performance. The air was thick with something unspoken, a tension that clung to the walls, like an unseen spectre. Then came the sound, a single muffled thud, not loud, not obvious, but enough to shift the course of the night. By the time anyone noticed, the crime had already been rewritten, the truth buried under carefully placed illusions. But illusions can only hold for so long. Someone had made a mistake, and that mistake was about to unravel everything. Reality, I mused, setting aside the morning's paper, has a habit of outpacing imagination. The sentiment, while hardly new, elicited a sharp glance from my companion. He tilted his immaculately groomed head, adjusted a barely perceptible crease in his trousers, and remarked dryly, "A philosopher at work. Truly, Hastings, your depth astounds me." Ignoring his sarcasm, I tapped the discarded newspaper. "You've perused today's headlines." "I have," he admitted, and unlike some, I ensured the paper was properly folded upon finishing. "Order and method, my friend, they are the pillars upon which brilliance stands." "Then you must have seen the report on the chilling murder of Victor Levington, the reclusive millionaire. That, I assure you, is what prompted my remark. Reality, dear Poirot, is not only stranger than fiction, but far more theatrical. Imagine the Fairfax household, unremarkable, ordinary, the very essence of English respectability. A father, mother, 2 children. Their evenings are spent in quiet routine, untouched by drama or intrigue. And then, without so much as a whisper of warning, their world is shattered. Last night, as they sat in their tastefully decorated parlor, immersed in a friendly game of bridge, the tranquility was upended. A frantic knock at the door, urgent, desperate. They answer, and there she stands, a woman clad in shimmering emerald silk, her face ashen, eyes wide with terror. She takes a faltering step inside, and as the golden lamplight catches her, a collective gasp rises. A dark stain spreads across the front of her gown, stark against the rich fabric. She opens her lips, a single breathless word escaping before she crumples to the ground. Murder. Perhaps they recognized her. The Fairfax family, their hands frozen mid-play, their faces drained of color. Celeste Duval, the luminous stage actress, whose name had graced every headline in recent weeks. The police arrived soon after, piecing together the shattered remnants of her disjointed tale. A secluded manor, a man's lifeless form upon an opulent rug, and a blood-stained letter clutched in his rigid fingers. And then, of course, the question hanging in the air like the scent of expensive cologne. Why had Celeste Duval, the glittering jewel of London's social scene, fled to the most unremarkable of homes on that fateful night? Poirot, who had been listening intently, gave a slow nod. A compelling narrative, mon ami. Yet remember this, true drama lies not in the obvious, but in the unseen threads that bind events together. The surface whispers one tale, but the truth is often buried beneath the facade. "So you are intrigued?" I asked eagerly. Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile. "Intrigued? Yes, and more so because, not an hour ago, I received a most interesting visitor, a man who claims that a certain letter, one which the police have yet to mention, holds the key to the entire affair." A chill ran down my spine. And who was this man? Poirot leaned back, his fingers pressed together. "That Hastings is the very question we must answer." "They found him there," I continued, lowering my voice. "Victor Levington, the man whose name was whispered with both admiration and contempt, sprawled across the Persian rug in his library, the back of his skull, shattered, as if some invisible hand had cracked an eggshell. A life of fortune and power, reduced to a silent corpse beneath the flickering glow of the chandelier. You indulge in theatrics, Hastings," Poirot murmured, a trace of amusement in his tone. "But, pray continue, this mystery has piqued my interest." He glanced toward the door, and as if on cue, the butler announced the arrival of our enigmatic guest. Count Nikolai Orlov entered, a striking figure, youthful yet burdened with the weight of generations. His angular face bore the unmistakable features of old Russian aristocracy, his sharp eyes filled with something between desperation and determination. "Monsieur Poirot," he began, his accent rolling like a whisper over cold marble, "I am in grave danger." "More than I can explain," Poirot steepled his fingers. I understand your distress, Count. Lady Celeste Duval is very dear to you, is she not? The Count inclined his head solemnly. She is my entire world. More than that, she is my future. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. You intend to marry her? It would not be the first time my family has defied tradition, he admitted, his voice steady. My uncle renounced a title for love. These are modern times, Monsieur Poirot. Celeste is no common woman. There is more to her past than the public knows. Some call her a performer, a mere dancer, but they do not see what I see. Poirot regarded him carefully. There are many rumors surrounding her origins, Count. Some say she was raised in the back streets of Paris. Others whisper that she is the illegitimate daughter of an exiled noble. The first is a lie, the young man said firmly. The second, he hesitated, then exhaled. It is true. She has let me piece together the fragments of her past, though she is sworn to secrecy. Every movement she makes, every glance she casts, it carries the elegance of royalty. Her blood is of a noble house, of that I have no doubt. Poirot is a fascinating thing, Poirot mused. I have witnessed its influence in the most unexpected of places, but let us not stray too far. Tell me, Count, what is it that you fear? Do you suspect that Lady Celeste is entangled in this dreadful crime? The Count's expression darkened. She knew Levington. He sought her out, obsessed over her, but she wanted nothing to do with him. He was relentless, and now he is dead, and she is missing. Poirot leaned forward, his voice a quiet blade of certainty. Then, Montu, we must find her, and we must do so before the police decide she is the one holding the dagger. Did she have any reason to fear him? Poirot's voice was calm, but his sharp eyes never left the young man's face. The Count hesitated, glancing toward the window as if expecting an unseen presence to emerge from the shadows. There was an incident. Have you heard of Madame Leora, the mystic? No, she is extraordinary. You should meet her some day. Celeste and I visited her last week. She read the cards for us. At first it was all vague talk of paths and choices, but then she turned the last card, the covering card, she called it. It was the King of Clubs. She looked Celeste in the eye and said, "You are watched. Someone holds your fate in their hands. You fear them, and with good reason.
The danger is near."
The Count's voice dropped lower. Celeste went pale. I saw her hands tremble. Yes, she whispered. I know. When we left, Madame Leora's final words echoed in my mind. Beware the King of Clubs, for he deals a deadly hand. I begged Celeste to explain, but she only shook her head. It is nothing, she insisted. But now, after last night, after what has happened to Levington, I am certain. He was the man she feared. Poirot steepled his fingers, his gaze unreadable. When you read the morning paper, your first thought was that Celeste in some moment of madness. No. The Count shook his head violently. It is impossible. She could never. Poirot rose and placed a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder. Do not torment yourself, Montu. Leave this matter in my hands. You will go to Holloway Manor. I believe she is still there, unable to leave due to the shock. I will go immediately. I have arranged matters through the embassy. You will have full access. Excellent. Hastings, you will accompany me. Poirot adjusted his cuffs, already preparing himself for what lay ahead. Au revoir, Count. We shall uncover the truth. Holloway Manor was a grand estate, its sprawling lawns and towering oaks exuding an air of solemnity. The gravel path wound its way toward an imposing facade, its ivy-clad walls whispering secrets of generations past. A butler, his face carved with the lines of a man who had seen much but spoken little, led them through the grand entrance hall. The library, monsieur, the butler murmured, pushing open the heavy oak doors. A magnificent room stretched before them, its grandeur dimmed by the weight of tragedy. A vast mahogany desk stood near the window overlooking the gardens. An ornate fireplace lay cold and empty, and at the very center, on the rich Persian carpet, was a dark stain, the only remnant of the life that had ended here. One window overlooked the sweeping driveway, the other the silent gardens beyond. Poirot stepped forward, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, but he would bring them together, one by one. It was in the recess of the latter that the body had lain, a shadowy corner of the grand library now bearing only the ghost of its gruesome secret. The corpse had been removed, not long before, the police having concluded their initial examination, but the air remained heavy with the scent of tragedy. "That is annoying," I murmured to Poirot. "Who knows what clues they may have destroyed?" My little friend merely smiled, his keen eyes flicking across the room with the precision of a man who trusted not in chance, but in intellect. How often must I tell you that clues come from within? In the little grey cells of the brain lies the solution of every mystery. He turned then to the butler, who had remained stiffly at attention. "I suppose, except for the removal of the body, the room has not been touched?" "No, sir. It's just as it was when the police came up last night. These curtains now, I see they pull right across the window recess. They are the same in the other window. Were they drawn last night?" "Yes, sir. I draw them every night." "Then Reedburn must have drawn them back himself." "I suppose so." Poirot's fingers played idly with his mustache, his expression one of deep contemplation. "Did you know your master expected a visitor last night?" The butler hesitated, his discomfort barely perceptible. "He did not say so, sir, but he gave orders he was not to be disturbed after dinner. You see, sir, there is a door leading out of the library onto the terrace at the side of the house. He could have admitted anyone that way." "Was he in the habit of doing that?" The butler coughed discreetly. "I believe so, sir." Poirot strode toward the door in question. It was unlocked. He stepped through it onto the terrace, where the cool night air still carried a faint trace of cigar smoke. To the right, the path curved toward the drive. To the left, it was bordered by a high red brick wall, enclosing what appeared to be a well-kept fruit garden. "The fruit garden, sir," the butler supplied helpfully. "There is a door leading into it farther along, but it was always locked at 6 o'clock. Poirot nodded, re-entering the library with his usual deliberate grace. The butler followed, his eyes darting toward the place where the body had been found, as though expecting some lingering horror to manifest itself. "Did you hear nothing of last night's events?" Poirot asked. "Well, sir, we heard voices in the library, a little before 9, but that wasn't unusual, especially being a lady's voice. Mr. Reedburn often entertained female visitors." The butler's tone remained carefully neutral, but of course once we were all in the servants' hall right on the other side of the house, we didn't hear anything at all. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "A lady's voice, you say, and yet none of the household saw a woman leave the premises?" "No, sir, not that I am aware of." "Curious," Poirot murmured, "most curious indeed." His fingers drummed lightly against his chin as he glanced once more toward the heavy curtains, as though seeing a pattern invisible to all but him. And then, about 11 o'clock, the police arrived, their flashing lanterns casting eerie shadows along the grand corridors of Mondesier. The butler, still visibly shaken, recounted what little he knew. "How many voices did you hear?" asked Poirot, his sharp eyes studying the man's face. "I couldn't say for sure, sir. I only noticed the lady's. She had a clear, urgent tone, frantic, almost desperate." "Ah," Poirot murmured, filing the information away. The butler hesitated before adding, "I beg pardon, sir, but Dr. Ryan is still in the house, if you would care to see him." We seized the opportunity at once. Within moments Dr. Ryan, a stout, cheery man with sharp, intelligent eyes, entered the room. He wasted no time in getting to the facts. Mr. Reedburn was found near the window, his head resting by the marble seat. There were 2 wounds, one between the eyes, a minor blow, but the fatal injury was to the back of the skull, a devastating impact. "He was lying on his back?" Poirot questioned. "Yes, the blood stain is still visible there." He pointed to a small dark stain on the floor, its edges slightly smudged, as if someone had attempted to clean it hastily. "Could the wound at the back of his head have been caused by a fall?" I ventured. The doctor shook his head firmly. "Impossible. The force of the blow suggests a direct attack. The weapon, whatever it was, penetrated the skull deeply." Poirot paced towards the ornate window recess. The elegant marble seat was sculpted with intricate lions' heads at the arms. He studied them with keen interest. A flicker of insight flashed across his face. Supposing he fell backwards, striking his head on this protruding lion's head before slipping onto the floor, could that account for the injury? Dr. Ryan hesitated. "Yes, theoretically, That would create a wound of the same nature. However, the angle at which his body was discovered makes that improbable, and besides, there would be traces of blood on the marble, unless they were washed away, Poirot suggested quietly. The doctor frowned. Perhaps. But who would benefit from making an accident appear as murder? Poirot did not respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the lion's head, fingers absently tapping his chin. Finally he turned and asked, "Could either of these blows have been delivered by a woman?" Dr. Ryan responded instantly, "Highly unlikely. The force required would be beyond the capability of most women." "You're thinking of Mademoiselle St. Clair, I presume?" Poirot smiled enigmatically. "I think of no one in particular until I am sure." He shifted his focus to the open French window as a gust of wind rustled the heavy curtains. The night held its secrets, but Poirot was determined to unveil them all. Through the open French window, Poirot surveyed the garden with a sharp, discerning gaze. The manicured hedges and winding pathways led towards a dense thicket, beyond which, obscured by moonlight and shadows, lay the faint outline of Daisy Mead. The air was thick with the lingering scent of rain-soaked earth, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves, whispering secrets of the night before. Poirot turned to the doctor. "Mademoiselle St. Clair fled through here." Dr. Ryan nodded. "Yes, straight through the garden, past the iron gate. If you look closely, you can just make out Daisy Mead between the trees. It's the only house visible from this side." "Curious," Poirot murmured, his fingers tracing an invisible pattern in the air. "Come, Hastings. We shall walk the path she took." We stepped out onto the damp grass, the ground yielding slightly underfoot. The iron gate creaked as we passed through, and I noted with interest the faint impressions of hurried footsteps in the softened soil, proof of a frantic escape. Beyond the gate, a narrow stretch of green led directly to the modest dwelling of Daisy Mead, its small frame hunched under the weight of the night's unfolding events. Poirot, ever meticulous, studied the steps leading up to the house's French window, then shook his head. For Mademoiselle, urgency excused an unconventional entrance. For us, propriety demands the front door. A maid, pale and nervous, admitted us. The house bore the unmistakable signs of a place unsettled by misfortune. The air was heavy, as if it held its breath, unwilling to release the tension coiled within its walls. The drawing room, untouched since the previous night, greeted us with ghostly stillness. The ashes in the grate lay undisturbed, and a bridge table remained set mid-game, a frozen moment in time. A hand of cards was thrown down in disarray, a silent witness to an interrupted evening. The decor was excessive, a jumble of trinkets and sentimental keepsakes. Portraits adorned the walls, familial faces of solemn expressions and stiff postures, their painted eyes following us as we moved. Poirot, more forgiving than I, adjusted a slightly crooked frame with a nod of approval. "La famille, its bonds surpass all else. Sentiment replaces beauty, non." I studied a particular family portrait, a distinguished man with formidable whiskers, a woman with a severe updo, and 3 children, 2 girls adorned with excessive ribbons and a thick-set boy with a gaze too old for his years. There was something unsettling in their fixed expressions, as though they held some long-buried truth. The door creaked open. A young woman entered, her face shadowed by an apprehension that went deeper than mere grief. Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. The game had shifted. The next move was his. Her dark hair was neatly arranged, pulled back in a way that suggested both discipline and indifference. She wore a drab-colored sports coat over a tweed skirt, the kind of attire that spoke of practicality rather than style. There was an air of quiet composure about her, an almost unnatural stillness that made her seem unaffected by the events of the night before. When she looked at us, her expression was inquiring but not curious, as though we were merely another task she had to deal with before moving on to more important matters. Poirot stepped forward, his manner gentle yet deliberate. "Miss Oglander, I regret to disturb you, especially after all you have been through. The whole affair must have been most distressing." The young lady gave a small measured nod. "It has been rather upsetting," she admitted cautiously. Her voice lacked emotion, and I found myself wondering whether she truly grasped the gravity of the situation. She seemed detached, her reaction bordering on indifference. The elements of drama appeared entirely wasted on her. "I must apologize for the state of this room," she continued in the same steady tone. Servants get so foolishly excited over things like this. I exchanged a glance with Poirot, who remained impassive. It was here that you were sitting last night, n'est-ce pas? He asked. Yes, we were playing bridge after supper when... Excuse me, how long had you been playing? Miss Oglander paused, considering. I really can't say. I suppose it must have been about 10 o'clock. We had already played several rubbers, I know, and you yourself were sitting where, facing the window. I was playing with my mother and had just gone one no trump. Suddenly, without any warning, the window burst open, and Miss St. Clair staggered into the room. Poirot's eyes gleamed. You recognized her? Miss Oglander hesitated, her brow furrowing slightly. I had a vague idea that her face was familiar. She is still here, is she not? Yes, but she refuses to see anyone. She is still quite prostrated. I think she will see me. Will you tell her that I am here at the express request of Prince Paul of Morania? For the first time Miss Oglander's impassivity seemed to waver. The mention of a royal prince had an effect on her, however slight. Without further comment, she turned and left the room. Poirot and I waited in silence, taking in the room around us. The remains of last night's game lay undisturbed, the bridge table still in place, a dummy hand exposed, cards scattered where they had been hastily abandoned. The ashes in the fireplace were undisturbed. It was as if time had frozen at the moment Valerie St. Clair had crashed through that window. Miss Oglander returned almost immediately. Mademoiselle St. Clair will see you in her room, she said simply. We followed her up the staircase, our footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The house was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. At the end of the corridor, Miss Oglander opened a door and ushered us inside. The bedroom was light and airy, with soft pastels on the walls and delicate furnishings that seemed at odds with the woman who lay stretched out on the couch by the window. Valerie St. Clair turned her head as we entered, and at once I was struck by the stark contrast between her and Miss Oglander. Their features were similar, the same dark hair, the same delicate bone structure, but the resemblance ended there. Where Miss Oglander was composed and indifferent, Valerie St. Clair was the embodiment of emotion. Her large, expressive eyes were clouded with turmoil. Her lips, slightly parted, trembled as though she were on the verge of speaking, but could not find the words. There was something almost theatrical about her, as though she were playing a role even in the depths of her distress. Her hands clutched at the arm of the couch, knuckles white, as though she were struggling to hold herself together. You come from Paul? She whispered, her voice raw with emotion. Poirot inclined his head. Yes, mademoiselle, he is deeply concerned for you. She let out a shuddering breath, her fingers relaxing slightly. Then he knows that you were afraid, and he fears what that fear may have driven you to do. She closed her eyes briefly, as if the weight of his words were too much to bear. When she opened them again, they burned with intensity. I didn't do it, she said fiercely. You must believe me. I didn't kill him, but I know who did. Poirot's expression did not change, but I knew that behind those keen eyes, his mind was already racing ahead. Then, mademoiselle, he said softly, it is time you told us everything. The night was heavy with a brooding silence, disturbed only by the rustle of leaves against the cold window panes. Inside the dimly lit study of Blackwood Manor, the remnants of an overturned chair and a shattered crystal decanter hinted at a struggle that had recently unfolded. The scent of brandy still lingered in the air, mingling with the faint metallic tang of blood. The body had been removed, leaving only a dark stain on the Persian rug, a ghostly reminder of the violent act that had taken place. Inspector Graves ran a gloved hand over the polished oak desk, his keen eyes scanning for any detail that the police might have overlooked. He let out a quiet sigh and turned to his companion, the enigmatic detective Victor Duval, who stood by the grand fireplace, his gaze fixed on the heavy velvet drapes framing the tall windows. They've disturbed the scene, Graves muttered, his frustration evident. Who knows what evidence might have been lost? Duval merely smiled, his fingers tapping his temple. My dear Graves, clues do not solely reside in bloodstains and broken glass. The truth is constructed here in the mind. He strode towards the window and swept the curtain aside. Tell me, was this drawn last night? The butler, A tall, austere man with an impassive face inclined his head. "Yes, sir, I draw them every evening, precisely at 8. Then Duval mused. Our unfortunate host must have pulled them back himself. But why? His fingers traced the edge of the curtain. Did Mr. Ashford expect a visitor? He gave strict instructions not to be disturbed after dinner, sir. However, there is a side door that leads directly to the terrace. It would have been easy for someone to enter unnoticed." Duval's expression darkened as he moved to the door in question. It swung open effortlessly. "Unlocked," he murmured. He stepped outside onto the terrace, where the cold night air carried the scent of damp earth. The pathway led to a red brick wall, the entrance to the estate's orchard. That door, the detective pointed. "Was it locked last night?" "Always at 6, sir." Duval nodded, and re-entered the study, his sharp gaze sweeping the room. "You heard nothing unusual, a few raised voices before 9, a woman's voice among them, but we were in the servants' hall, far from here." At that moment, a knock sounded at the door, and Dr. Lennox entered, his white coat slightly rumpled. "You'll want the details, I assume," he said briskly. "Mr. Ashford was found here, by the window. 2 wounds, one between the eyes, another at the back of the skull. The second was fatal. Could he have struck his head on the marble window seat?" Duval asked, studying the ornately carved lion's head that jutted out from the stone. Lennox shook his head. "Impossible. The force was too great, the angle all wrong, and if he had, there would be blood on the marble. Unless it was cleaned," Duval murmured, before turning sharply. "Could a woman have inflicted either wound?" Lennox hesitated. "Highly unlikely, the strength required, but not impossible." The doctor frowned, but said nothing. Duval turned to Graves, his eyes gleaming. "Then we must speak to Miss Eleanor Blackwood. She was the last to see him alive." A tense silence hung in the air as the 2 men exchanged glances. The case had taken a darker turn, and the real hunt had only just begun. The wind howled through the skeletal branches outside, as the clock chimed 11. A thick tension lay in the air, heavy and oppressive. The house, grand yet eerily silent, bore the unmistakable weight of tragedy. The inspector's boots echoed ominously as he stepped inside the dimly lit study. A mahogany desk stood near the large French windows, their curtains billowing slightly in the night breeze, and there, sprawled across the floor, lay Lord Armitage, a man both feared and revered, his lifeless eyes staring into the void. 2 wounds marred his skull, one at the front, another at the back. The doctor, a composed man in his 50s, knelt beside the corpse. "One between the eyes, another at the back of the head," he murmured. "The fatal blow was delivered from behind. The force was considerable." The inspector crouched, fingers tracing the polished marble of the ornate fireplace. "Could he have struck his head on this as he fell?" "Impossible," the doctor replied. "The weapon penetrated the skull. This was no accident." A faint smear of blood glistened on the carpet, yet there was none on the hard marble. The inspector's eyes narrowed. "Unless the scene was tampered with." A nervous cough broke the silence. A maid, pale and trembling, clutched her apron. "I heard voices, sir, a lady's voice mostly pleading, and then, a man's anger, then a crash." "What time was this?" The inspector's voice was steady, yet keen. "A little after 10, and then," her voice dropped to a whisper, "the house went deathly quiet." "And the lady?" he pressed. "Gone, sir, vanished into the night." The inspector turned to the window. The garden stretched into the darkness, shadowed by the imposing shape of the old oak trees. Beyond them, barely visible in the moonlight, was the solitary outline of Ravenswood Manor. "Then that's where we go next." His voice was grim, laced with certainty. The night was far from over. The hunt had just begun. Poirot's sharp gaze swept the dimly lit room, his fingers tracing idly over the worn edges of the playing cards. The remnants of last night's bridge game lay undisturbed, a silent testament to the evening's events. A single card was missing. "The king of clubs," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hastings, do you see?" I frowned, glancing at the deck. It seemed insignificant, but Poirot's intense focus told me otherwise. "I fear," he continued, "I have been misled by the obvious." Before I could press him further, Miss Oglander returned, her composure betraying nothing of the turmoil that had invaded her home. If you would wait a moment, she said. My mother wishes to speak with you. Poirot nodded, but his gaze flickered toward the window. He strode towards it, and gestured abruptly. The blinds last night, were they drawn? Miss Oglander hesitated. No, I don't believe they were. He turned sharply. Yet there was moonlight, and you were sitting here facing this very window. You saw nothing. She shook her head. We were preoccupied with our game, and besides, nothing like this has ever happened before. Poirot's lips curled into a small knowing smile. Quite so, but things are rarely as they seem, mademoiselle. At that moment, the door swung open, and a stately woman entered, her hands clutching a ledger. She exuded quiet authority, the weight of household responsibilities evident in her bearing. Sir, you say you come on behalf of Miss St. Clair. I come from a friend of hers, madame. The woman's sharp eyes studied him. I see. I had thought perhaps. She let the thought trail off, but her meaning lingered in the air. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. You will be relieved to know that Mademoiselle St. Clair is leaving tomorrow. The flicker of tension in the woman's shoulders eased. Oh, she said, unable to conceal her relief. Poirot inclined his head slightly. And now, madame, I will bid you good morning. As we stepped out into the crisp morning air, I could hold my tongue no longer. Poirot, what mistake did you make? He gave a small chuckle, but his eyes gleamed with renewed determination. Hastings, we must begin again, but this time, mon ami, we shall not be fooled by shadows. His words sent a shiver down my spine. The case was not over, it was only beginning. The cold air of the evening settled heavily over the grand estate, its silent corridors hiding whispers of a secret yet untold. The butler, rigid in posture, barely masked his curiosity at our unexpected return to Mondesir. Poirot, his sharp eyes alight with a knowing gleam, moved with purpose toward the library, his hands clasped behind his back in thought. Inside the dimly lit room, Poirot's gaze flickered towards the windows. I instinctively turned to the one overlooking the garden, but to my surprise, Poirot approached the opposite side, the one that faced the gravel driveway. He knelt before the grand marble lion's head carved into the wall, his fingers tracing over its intricate grooves, until they paused over a faintly discolored smear. There, he murmured, his voice tinged with quiet triumph. I followed his gaze, and saw what he had already deduced. A thin, almost imperceptible stain against the polished stone, a matching one darkened the pristine floor beneath it. Poirot rose smoothly. He was struck, a powerful blow right between the eyes. He gestured toward the marble. He fell backward, hitting his skull against this very carving before collapsing onto the floor. And yet, Poirot turned with a flourish, his expression inscrutable. He was not left here. I frowned. But the body was found by the garden window. Exactly, Poirot said, dragged across the room. But why? He let the question hang in the air. Because, mon ami, the one who moved him, had everything to gain by ensuring we believed the death occurred there. A chill ran down my spine. Then we have been deceived. We, Hastings. Poirot nodded. But now the deception is undone. He stepped toward the center of the room, where the shadows stretched long and menacing. It was never the intruder, no tramp, no unknown menace lurking in the darkness. The true culprit was already inside these walls. The weight of his words pressed against me. But if it was not an outsider, then who? Poirot turned slightly, his hand slipping into his coat pocket. With a flourish, he produced an object between his fingers, a single crisp playing card, the king of clubs. I started. You found it. May we, Hastings, Poirot said, his lips curving into a smile, and now the final piece of the puzzle falls into place. He studied the card for a moment, then let it rest against the polished surface of the desk. The game is over, mon ami. Now it is time to confront the real player behind this deadly hand. The heavy wooden door creaked as it swung open, revealing a dimly lit room filled with the faint scent of old parchment and polished mahogany. She sat there, draped in a crimson silk robe, the flickering candlelight making the fabric appear as if it were alive, pulsing with an unspoken energy. Her dark eyes, smoldering with an intensity that defied exhaustion, met his with an unreadable expression. You come from him. Her voice was slow, deliberate, like the careful strokes of an artist painting a masterpiece of deception. Poirot inclined his head. Yes, mademoiselle, I am here on his behalf, and yours. She sighed, reclining against the plush velvet of the chaise lounge. What do you wish to know? Everything. Every detail of last night. She smiled, weary but unwavering. Do you think I would lie? I have no reason to. That man held something over me, a secret, a dagger poised at my throat. I pleaded, I bargained, but he was immovable, and now he is dead. But let me be clear, monsieur, I did not kill him. Poirot studied her face, searching for the tremor of deception, but found none. Of course not, mademoiselle, but please tell me, what transpired last night? She exhaled slowly. I offered him money. He laughed. I offered him jewels, every last piece I owned. He considered, but then named his own price. You can guess what that was. I refused. I called him what he was, a monster, and then she hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of her robe. There was a sound. A sound. Poirot leaned forward. Yes, from behind the curtains. Her voice faltered, and for the first time, fear flickered in her gaze. He heard it too. He turned sharply, flung back the heavy drapes, and there he was, a man disheveled, wild-eyed, a figure from a nightmare. Poirot remained silent, urging her on. The man lunged at him, a single brutal strike, then another. Reedburn staggered, his hands clutching at empty air, and then he collapsed. The attacker turned. His hands were stained crimson. He reached for me. She shuddered. I ran. I did not stop. I saw lights in the distance, and I fled toward them. I remember crashing into the room, gasping only one word, murder, before darkness swallowed me. Poirot nodded, absorbing every syllable. This man, could you describe him? She hesitated, her brows furrowing. His face is burned into my mind. I will never forget it. And the window facing the drive, were the curtains drawn. Her lips parted slightly, uncertainty clouding her features. I think, no, they were open. Poirot's eyes gleamed, curious. The other curtains were closed, yet that one remained open. A small detail, but often, mademoiselle, it is the smallest details that unravel the greatest mysteries. She watched him with an unreadable expression. Will you find him? The man who did this? Poirot smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I do not chase shadows, mademoiselle. I reveal them. The dim glow of the street lamp barely illuminated the winding path as Detective Lucien Graves and his companion, Maxwell Hart, stepped out of the grand estate. A light drizzle had begun to fall, making the cobblestones slick beneath their shoes. Just as they reached the gates, a maid scurried past, clutching a bundle of linens. Graves halted her with a raised hand. A moment, miss. Were you the one who cleaned the lady's shoes last night? The maid, startled, shook her head. No, sir. I don't believe they were cleaned at all. Graves arched an eyebrow. Curious, he murmured, turning to Hart. Tell me, if one were to run through wet grass, through mud, through blood, would the soles of their shoes not tell the tale? Hart's eyes widened, but her shoes were spotless. Graves nodded, lips curling in satisfaction. Precisely, they were never worn outside. She never ran, she never fled. The story she spun was as fabricated as the man she claimed to have seen. Hart inhaled sharply, his mind racing. Then the body was moved, Graves interjected. Dragged to the farthest window, arranged just so, to make it appear that the victim collapsed there. A clever ruse had it not been for one detail. He motioned toward the grand house behind them. The game, the missing card. Hart frowned. You believe the missing ace of spades was no accident? Graves pulled a single crumpled playing card from his pocket. I retrieved this from behind the settee in the drawing room, torn as if by a nervous hand. The ace of spades, the card of death, of deception. And what did our dear host claim? That they played an uninterrupted game of whist all evening, with only 51 cards. Impossible. A silence hung between them, punctuated only by the distant hoot of an owl. Hart exhaled, shaking his head. And so we start again. Graves smiled, slipping the card back into his coat. Yes, my friend, but this time we shall not be fooled. The gas lamps flickered as they turned toward the manor once more, the mystery far from over. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still wet, the scent of damp earth filling the crisp night air. As we made our way through the winding path leading back to the estate, Poirot walked with an unusual urgency, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness. I struggled to keep up, my mind still reeling from the events of the evening. "Poirot, what exactly have we uncovered?" I asked, breathless. He paused beneath the glow of a street lamp, his reflection distorted in the puddles at his feet. "Mon ami, we have uncovered a deception so carefully woven that even I, Hercule Poirot, was nearly deceived." His voice was edged with something rare, unease. We reached the wrought iron gates of Daisymead, where the lights inside cast long shadows against the curtains. The house seemed to breathe with a quiet stillness, as if holding its secrets close. Poirot knocked, and after a moment, the same maid who had greeted us before answered with wary eyes. She stepped aside, ushering us into the dimly lit drawing room, where Mrs. Oglander waited, her hands gripping the back of a chair. "You return, Monsieur Poirot. I assume you have more questions?" she asked, her tone composed, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. Poirot smiled, stepping forward with the ease of a man who already knew the answers. "Madame, I return not for questions, but for truths. The truth that binds this family together in ways the world does not see. The truth that Valerie St. Clair is in fact your daughter." The room fell silent. Even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to hold its breath. Mrs. Oglander's fingers tightened on the chair, but she did not deny it. I gasped. "You mean why Hastings?" The resemblance was there all along, but it was masked by illusion. One daughter stayed, the other was cast out, or so the world was made to believe. But blood calls to blood, and in her moment of peril, Valerie sought the only protection she knew. Mrs. Oglander closed her eyes briefly before opening them, her voice barely above a whisper. She needed help. John went to her, but he did not mean to. Poirot raised a hand. "No, madame, I know. Reed Bain was not meant to die. It was an act of passion, a single blow delivered in anger. But what followed, that was the true brilliance. The deception, the carefully laid game of bridge, the positioning of the body. This was no crime of impulse. This was strategy, a performance worthy of the stage." She exhaled shakily. "So what will you do now, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot reached into his pocket and withdrew the missing king of clubs, placing it gently on the polished surface of the table. "I return this to its rightful place, and I will say nothing. Your family bond, madame, is stronger than the law. It is not my place to break it." I stared at him in shock. "Poirot, you mean to let them go?" Poirot turned to me with a knowing smile. "My friend, justice is not always served by the gallows. Sometimes it is served by the weight of one's conscience. They will live with this night forever. That is punishment enough." We left Daisymead in silence, the echoes of its secrets lingering behind us. The case was closed, yet I could not shake the feeling that somewhere, in the shadows of that house, the ghost of the truth would never rest.